So welcome everybody to this third in the series from the Climate Courage campaign, Stories from the Classroom. And the purpose of these events is to kind of highlight what's going on in our classrooms, in our schools in relation to climate education, and to try and shine a spotlight on people who are doing really innovative work in that space. And certainly Cape and Hina, Dave and Lee Hoth, who's with us today, fall into that category of sort of really innovative educators. One bit of housekeeping, so we are recording today, and we will put the recording out on YouTube so that people who aren't here today can also have a chance to see it, and then it's a resource as well that people can go back to. Before I introduce Lee, we're gonna put you into small breakout rooms straight away, just so you can check in with somebody else who's on the call, relax into things. And we're going to suggest the question, could you discuss why a one-size-fits-all approach to climate education is not good enough for our children and young people? Why is a one-size-fits-all climate education not good enough for our children and young people? We'll put that question in the chat, hopefully Tamsin or Josephine, and then we're going to send you into breakout rooms just for 3 minutes or so, and then when we come back we'll gauge opinion on that statement. So some sense that we need something, or schools might need something to get them started on a journey. Head teachers is another good starting place, says somebody in the chat. And that resonates very much both with the Climate Courage campaign, where we're calling for kind of leadership and a system that enables leadership or encourages, motivates leadership to lead. And it also resonates with Cape's approach, I think, which we're going to hear more about from Lee. Any other thoughts?
I'd just like to add, I think it's very context specific, isn't it? And on the particular learners and on the learning environment and what level of understanding or expertise maybe that the staff have. And so that idea that, you know, one size fits all doesn't really, it's not very inclusive to all of those different needs.
Thanks, Kathy. Someone else has put, climate change means different things to different people. So of course a one size fits all isn't going to be relevant to everybody. And we also started with that idea of place, you know, and climate change to a school in rural Wales may look very different to a coastal school in Norfolk, to an inner city school. Okay. Thank you for offering views on that. So I'm going to open up a space now for Lee Hoth to share on the work of CAPE, or Climate Adapted Pathways for Education. So Lee is a co-founder of CAPE and a professor of science education at Leeds Trinity University. They work with a whole range of schools and academy trusts. And she's going to be talking to us about why a simple approach to climate change education is a challenging one, and how a curriculum first stance is needed in order to implement meaningful climate change education. She'll outline some of the learnings of working with school leaders from across the country. She'll talk a bit about their new podcast, Imagining Otherwise, and generally about the developments in their work and what they've learned through their kind of really in-depth experience. That was the thing that stuck with me, Lee, from our initial conversation was, you talked about working with schools who are really bought into this because it's about going into the detail, and really kind of doing stuff that's not surface level but makes a difference. So I'll pass over to Lee. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here. I fully appreciate that it is very end of termy for a lot of people. So let me see if I can share my screen without any problems. Thanks, Les, for that introduction there. As you've said, I'm co-founder of Climate Adaptive Pathways for Education with Hina Dave. I do have a day job, which is at Leeds Trinity University, and I work in science education as a professor of professional practice, which I think is quite important. It means that I don't just sit in an office doing research. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a very quick introduction to CAPE, for those of you who don't know that. I'm going to talk about what we see in schools. So the things that I'm going to present to you aren't just my views and Hina's views. We work with a huge number of school leaders, and we're very lucky with the schools that we're working with in the multi-academy trusts. Now they are predominantly in England, and I fully appreciate we have got people from the devolved nations here. We are now working with Scottish schools to pilot some things there, and we're going to move into Wales next year. So we're going to talk about what we see in schools and why we need a strategic approach to curriculum that is related to climate change education. So who we are, we're a charity. We were established as a charity last October, so a relatively young charity, but have been about 3 years in existence altogether. And we are made up of some researchers, educators from across early years, primary, secondary, FE, HE, and other partners, which include the Tate Modern, the Natural History Museum, a number of multi-academy trusts, and we are very privileged to have Mary Myatt as our patron for education and Adam Reid, who is our industry patron. And what we want to do is we really want to work to make a difference in terms of what we're dealing with in terms of climate change. I'm assuming we'll share these slides later. You can have a read at what we do at your leisure. So what we really want to do is equip teachers and school leaders with knowledge and skills. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we need both of those and not just one in order to make a difference, but to help those children and young people take climate action that is meaningful, that they understand, and actually how that is different from activism, but to be able to take collective action. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment or two. So let's see, is this going to work? So our priorities sit here. I'm just going to rattle through these again. Oh, it's going to go slow with my computer. I apologize for that. We're very much about education. We focus on implementation. There's some familiar faces on the call who have been through our professional development programme, and they will know that we are absolutely focused on implementation before any sort of action. It's really important we think about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're going to do that in the context. Again, you mentioned about context being important, earlier. We're very much focused on curriculum development. Somebody said about having a starting point, and I would argue that we've already got a starting point for climate change education because we have a curriculum that is developed in a school that actually works to meet the needs of the children and young people who are in that context. But again, a little bit about that later on. And we run a professional development programme that spans 11 months called Climate Wise Schools. We're very much around advocacy. What we want to do is to develop partnerships. We want to develop expertise and share knowledge. It's not about us having all that expertise ourselves, and we really want to draw upon people who can support that. But we also want to make sure that what we are doing is research informed, and evaluated fully. We've sort of held back. We're onto the third cohort of our professional development course, and we're only just starting to think about how we evaluate that, because it's really important that whilst we've done evaluations as we go through it, in terms of that longer term impact, we can't just rush in and say, what does this look like immediately, because people go away with that buzz after a course. We need to know what it looks like further down the line. We want evidence-informed insights. We want it to be robust. We want to contribute to research, which we are doing through a number of partnerships, that actually has a really solid base with the children and the teachers that we're working with, and not just drawn on from other areas. And that's not to say that other areas don't have value, but it's really important that what we research is focused on children in the classroom as well. So what do we see happening in schools? Come on, little slide. So what we know is that our pupils are after all sorts of things. And that doesn't always align with what the schools are saying. So they are demanding high quality climate change education. There's a huge number of reports out there now from a number of bodies that will say they want to know about climate change education, and they do not just want to know about it in science and geography. They want to know about it across other subject areas. We know that children are absolutely focused on justice. Anybody who's a teacher who's ever told a child off one day for one thing and not another child the next day will understand that their sense of justice is really, really high. So they expand that onto sort of global issues and local ones, and they really are driven by this sense. So they want climate justice and they want to understand that, and that's a really complex area as far as I'm concerned. But some of the work that we've been doing with Bishop's University in Canada has actually, this is the children's word. We've been working with children from primary is me going into a Scottish, year 3 up to year 6. And the word that they've used is despair. And that's worrying, that terrifies me. I have 11-year-old twins, and the thought of them feeling despair about the state that this planet is in, whilst it's an understandable emotion, worries me, because I don't want my children to feel like that. What's fascinating is that in the research, the children then told us that actually without despair, they wouldn't have hope, because that's what drives them to want to make a difference. It's very complicated, but it highlights the eco-anxieties that our children and young people have, and the focus that we have going forward on mental health and eco-anxiety is a really, really valid one. But what we then see is schools very focused on decarbonisation, and that's not the same as climate change education. What we also see is them taking a really resource and action plan driven approach. And by that, I'm not suggesting that resources are not good or that an action plan is not good, but actually when we teach any other subject in a school, we look at what the curriculum intent is. We then work out how to best teach our children that in the context in which they are in, and to meet them where they are at. And then we identify the resources that we would use. We don't see that with climate change education. What we see is teachers who lack confidence, perhaps subject knowledge, maybe the time. So what they do is they start off with the resources and they go, okay, right, I found this great thing online. I'm going to use that to teach this. And then it sort of goes backwards from the way that we would teach any other subject. And one of the things that I'd like to push for is that climate change education is given the same respect as any other subject within the curriculum. So what we also see is two types of school leaders predominantly. Oh, sorry, I'll come on to the two types in a moment. I'm getting ahead of myself. What school leaders tell us when they say that they are doing climate change education are these things. They say we do litter picking. We either go out and do it, we talk about it, or we have an eco council. We do lots of recycling. That's become really important with the changes to the recycling that we're seeing. We've planted trees. We've had a charity deliver a project, or it's done in science and geography. None of those things are bad things, and I don't want anybody to go away thinking that's what I'm saying. What I am saying is they are not climate change education. Okay, they are really good things. We want our children to be out supporting biodiversity. We want them to be keeping the environment clean. We want them to recycle. But they are actions that they can undertake, but they are not curriculum driven. They are not curriculum linked. And actually, that's not high quality climate change education. So you may have seen this report. It's one of many telling us that actually, as I said earlier, that children want to know about climate change education, climate change, and they want to know about it across subjects. So this was sort of older children. We work with predominantly primary schools, but have got a a number of secondary schools as part of the Cape Alliance, and we're starting to move into that, because in some ways it's actually a more complex area to really meaningfully integrate what we're doing. But these children and young people want to know about climate change. I appreciate this is a long quote, but actually what we see here is that it's quite challenging. So we've got a situation where Hickman wrote this article. It was published in the Lancet, and that's quite interesting in that it's a medical journal. So recognizing that there is actually a real mental health issue, and that is a health issue that climate change is creating. And identifies, this is a really emergent issue, but it's really complicated as well, because we've got so many different factors in terms of the environmental, social, cultural. It's not necessarily predictable. What we've got is a problem that's not going to go away, because it's a really naughty problem. It's a wicked problem. And it's one that actually is constantly changing, because it's not a static situation. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's why I will come back to the question you were discussing earlier. We can't have a one size fits all, because that is going to change very, very quickly. So what we see in school leadership are two approaches. We see the head barriers, the ones who go, actually, either it's already happening, I can't get this on my agenda because I've got so much else on. And again, I fully appreciate there are so many competing demands. Or we see the people who go, let's just get something done and scramble. Can we get this done as quickly as possible, and sort of race to the top of getting something in place. And I don't think either of those are particularly positive. I think there's a real need for strategic urgency. So really slowing this down to get it right in terms of what can we do for the context that we are in. So what does that strategic approach look like? So it's about not doing this. It's about not identifying the problem and trying to skip to the solution. It's about really, those of you who've been in education for long enough will know that the quick fixes mean that we end up having to pick something up 2 or 3 years down the line. We've not got the opportunity to do that with climate change. We need to get this right. So I think that argument of let's slow it down and get it right is a really valid one at this point. There are a number of things here, and I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to sort of rattle through these, but knowing your school and your school community is so important. The impact, where can you make an impact? What can you do in light of the children and young people that are in front of you? Identifying vulnerability. We know that the global north and global south is mirrored within our communities. So we've got to be very, very clear about what the vulnerabilities and then those risks are to our children and young people. And as Les mentioned, that's very different if you're on the east coast of Norfolk as opposed to if you are in rural West Yorkshire. So we've got to really think about this. So that knowledge is important. But what we also want is some sort of coherence here. And this goes back to that idea of not being led by resources. We want to know what practice works. We need to have that curriculum approach. Now, I appreciate that's changing. We've probably not got time to talk about that. But what we then want is a really strong framework for climate change education that then supplements our pedagogical approaches. How do we teach this? How do we teach this to the children and young people that are in front of us? And that then is that actually your pedagogical content knowledge. How do I teach this knowledge in the way that is most appropriate for them and what I'm teaching? And that then manifests as that classroom practice that we see that needs to be high quality in order for our children and young people to have the experience that they deserve. In terms of a framework for curriculum, this has been developed with Mary Myatt, and we identify like 3 main sort of staples to this. Knowledge is really important. Our children and young people need knowledge to in terms of what climate change is and what the impacts are before they can even start to think about mitigating it. I've already mentioned the issues around eco-anxiety, children's sense and despair. We've got to help them proactively engage in ways of developing self-regulation. And then actually collective action, which is really important rather than putting the burden of responsibility on any one individual. And we have 4 principles that surround that. It being coherent, that knowledge has to be sequenced, it has to be age appropriate, and it has to prepare our children and young people going forward so they don't just do the same climate change education lesson 4 times in their schooling life. It's got to be authentic, which means that it's got to be something that's actually lives with them or resonates with their lived life. Principled in terms of that high quality. How are we ensuring that this matches with the lived values of the school? And being enriched, it has to be available to all our children and young people. The problem with our eco clubs is they are accessed by the most advantaged children. There's huge amounts that tells us that our most disadvantaged don't access extracurricular activities. So how do we make sure that the curriculum is enriched by this? So I appreciate that's a very, very quick run through something that is actually quite a massive sort of amount of information behind that slide. So I'm 1 minute late. I'm quite proud of myself here. So what I would like you to do is to think about this in some groups. I'm going to position this. I don't think a one size fits all is good enough. It's not high enough quality. And as I say, we wouldn't do it with other subjects. Why would we do it with climate change education? But what is a curriculum? What is a really good high quality curriculum? So I think there's something about telling a compelling story. Okay, and that could be the story of carbon. I like to talk about the story of carbon through science, through geography, through art. How do we bring that knowledge to life for our children and young people? The example I often give is that in GCSE biology, I was a science teacher, we teach children and young people about drugs and the impact of drugs. That knowledge on its own, does that stop them going and taking drugs? Absolutely not. So telling them about climate change on its own isn't going to help. Okay, so we need to work out a way that we can bring that really to life in the context of place, as mentioned earlier on. How does our curriculum act as a map, helping our children navigate? How do we provide pathways and overcome the barriers that we know our children and young people are going to face? There's no point in us suggesting beeswax wrapping instead of cling film when our children are eating from food banks. We've got to really think about those sorts of things. And actually, it's got to align with the school's purpose and vision, which is why I think school leadership is really, really important in this. So I think you now have, I'm going to look to Tamsin here to pop you back into breakout rooms to be able to discuss these things. But actually, we've sort of discussed why a one size fits all doesn't approach. How do we ensure that climate change education has the same respect as other subject areas?
Okay, everybody back. So big thank you, Lee, for that whistle-stop tour through, you know, there's a lot in that presentation that you've just made. And in our, while people were in the breakout rooms, we were just talking about the curriculum and assessment review with DFE, which I'm sure people are aware of. You know, that forms the backdrop to some of this. So how did people get on in the breakout rooms? Lee, have you got particular points that you want to kind of
I think people can either pop in the chat some of their sort of key headlines, or if anybody wants to risk unmuting, yes, unmuting, and sharing some views, I'm sure that'd be welcome.
And again, this is a, you know, we want this to be a really open discussion. It's not a kind of expert-led, well, it is expert-led by Lee, but you know what I mean. It's you know, we're all constructing this together.
I appreciate there was an awful lot in there. Oh, Jeff's put his hand up. We'll let Jeff in. This makes me a little bit nervy. He's one of our trustees. So I'm sure he's going to say nice things as a result of that.
Go for it, Jeff.
I'm not sure about it at all. Go on, Jeff.
Thanks, Liz. Good afternoon, Lee. I was just going to bring back to something that was said in our group, because the conversation was that for a lot of people who are not in education, it's too big. the topic is enormous and it scares people. And there's a whole conversation about how we break it down in ways that people can start to feel they have some agency and they can do something. And I'm going to throw that in and go away again, because otherwise I'll start talking as well, Les.
I think actually it is a massive area, isn't it? And I think this is why in schools with people who are really well intentioned about doing something, do something without knowing what it is that they need to do or should do. So that's where you get that broad, fluffy, big activity or project or something going on, rather than actually knowing where to start with it. And which is why I come back to if you look at this from a curriculum perspective and look at sequencing and having a coherent pathway of knowledge first, then it immediately breaks it down into something smaller and more manageable that teachers already know how to do. So yeah, it is a big thing. Thank you.
And in terms of that sequencing, Lee, apart from CAPE, are there other kind of examples of good practice that you could highlight, or that other people are aware of? I'm thinking about the Leeds DEC, for example.
So there are some examples. So Leeds DEC have just changed to Global Learning Leads, and they have got curriculum example documentation on their website. There are documents that track change the curriculum. I think it stops a step short of doing that sequencing bit. It shows us where we can make links, but that's not the same as it being sequenced and coherent. But I do think that there is a sense of looking at what we do, our curriculum making principles that we use in school. I was going to mention this later. We are producing curriculum making guidance for primary science, geography and art. I see Michelle's on the call. She's leading the geography. And that's been looking at actually what is this subject about? How can we then make links with this subject? And there's an examples of how it can be sequenced, but it is by no means for a drag and drop. It's about actually, here is a way to start looking at this, and then how will you adapt this for your own curriculum?
There's a comment in the chat from Megan about weaving climate and nature education through different subjects, giving it parity. I'm also mindful as well, Lee, of the comment that you made about secondary schools, because I think this is what we hear from other people is, you know, how in primary schools, nature and outdoor learning, there's that sense of wonder and engagement and awe. And by the time that comes around to secondary schools, you know, nature's not so cool anymore.
I think also the demands are really different, aren't they? It's very, very exam focused, isn't it, in secondary? And that's you know, we do know that the assessment tail wags the education dog, and that's the reality of the situation. But yeah, I think there is something about how we can really make those links. And, you know, Michelle and I just had a conversation last week about actually how it's not about teaching something, it's not about doing more, it's about the context and the lens with which you teach the content that is there to be taught already. It takes time, it takes some thinking about. In terms of like the outdoor use, again, I think we need to be, I would argue that we need to be mindful of this and be a little bit stronger with actually taking children outside. Yes, it has a positive influence, and yes, we know that there's plenty that will tell us that they benefit from being outside. That does not mean that they are learning about climate change. So if we come back to where I stand in terms of we want high quality climate change education, we also need to be thinking about what are they doing outside? What is that outdoor learning? What are they doing in nature that will also help them to add to that knowledge, help the self-regulation, help the collective action develop? Just taking them out and being immersed in it isn't quite enough. But that's a much bigger conversation. All of these are bigger conversations. We need another 4 hours. Not at this time of year, though.
And we've got another 4 minutes.
That's fine.
Any other views that people want to put forward? There's plenty going into the chat at the moment. Kathy?
Yeah, just a thought on this term, climate change education. I think, it means different things to different people. And what you were just saying now, Lee, it makes me think about, the social implications of climate change and the difference and how that affects different people and how it crosses all subject areas. And what we don't have in schools is spaces where people can come together and see how their subjects necessarily intersect, particularly in secondary, perhaps more so in primary, where you've got one teacher in charge of all of that curriculum. So they can teach a theme which would embed lots of things. But once you get to secondary, that's kind of lost. So it's really just a question about how can we encourage that, sharing of disciplines around climate change and understanding that it's a multifaceted thing that is very different for different people.
Yeah, and I think that's why I would strongly argue this is a school leadership issue. What we have are really enthusiastic teachers in school who want to do this, and they absolutely commit to doing everything that they can, and then they leave, or they get changed to become the maths lead, or they become a head of science, or something happens and they just don't have the capacity to do that. If it's a school leadership issue, and we work with a number of trusts who absolutely have put this at the heart of what they do. And that's a very bold decision when we are in the crisis that we are in terms of financial, SEND, everything is a mess in that sense when you're trying to lead a school at the moment. So to then say, and actually, folks, what we're going to do is prioritise climate change education is a bold step. But to pick up on what you said, Kathy, there about language, I think it's really important. At CAPE, we very much focus on climate change because for us, that broad statement, broad sweep word of sustainability is really problematic. We work with diverse groups of pupils, children and young people. Some cultures say there is no such thing as sustainability. I read a definition the other day that was presented in an article that was submitted for publication, and it had I can't remember the actual definition. It was from the 1980s, and it said something about not using, the traditional sort of not using more than we have got type thing. And I had to go back and say we've breached that. You can't use that as a definition for sustainability. But equally, we have schools that say, okay, let's have a sustainability curriculum. But what does that mean? What if we were to do a poll on this now, we would get so many different views on what that means. So we've got to be really mindful about the language that's being used to make sure that we have that high quality, I think, going forward.
Okay. Lots of rich content in the chat, which we'll capture. I'm afraid we're going to have to bring that conversation to draw it to a close. I'm going to attempt to make a link between the point about leadership and the Climate Courage Schools campaign, which we launched 3 weeks ago. And one of the calls in that campaign is around, really helping school leaders, head teachers, governors, school governors, to be incentivized to see this as a priority and to work to grapple with the complexity in the kind of ways that Lee's outlined. And before the end of the call, Josephine, hopefully you can just outline the calls for action from that Climate Courage campaign. Lee, there's a couple of other kind of specific pieces of work from CAPE. I'm thinking about the podcast which I was listening to earlier today, which then got me into listening to Tidelines, Robert Robertson, which was great. But yeah, I don't know if you want to just kind of give a brief sort of intro to the podcast and also the curriculum work.
Yeah, so the second report that we wrote, we decided there's a line in a song that said, "Waiting for the moment when the cynicism dies and hope returns." And I said, that's what we're doing at CAPE. That's what our work is. So we decided to write to this band and say, can we use your lyrics in a report? Then start a major stalking exercise. They eventually said yes because we broke them down. And what ended up happening was we need a podcast that tells different stories. So the title is Imagining Otherwise: Stories for an Unwritten Future. And we have on the first episode Jamie Elliott from the Tate Modern and Robert Robertson, who's the lead singer of from Tidelines. And it's really interesting to look at this through a completely different lens. Neither of them are particularly teachers, educators, but just to hear actually the importance, the value, the position that climate change has in terms of their work, their art. The next episode we've just edited now, and it's fabulous because it's got Hywel Roberts and Mary Myatt on, who are just fantastic as two very entertaining and knowledgeable people. We've got 3 more episodes in this first series coming out across the remainder of the year. So yeah, so have a listen. It'll be on Spotify and on YouTube and other things that I can't remember that I should really know about. I'm going to get told off from Jeff for not knowing that.
Tamsin's just put the link to that in the chat.
Amazing. Thank you. Yes, there is a link on the website to the podcast. Thank you, Tamsin. I mentioned about the curriculum guidance that we are producing, and they'll be published early in the new academic year. And I'll also just mention the professional development programme that we run. We've just started cohort 3. It's not too late to join if anybody's interested. There's a couple of people putting plugs in the chat. Thank you, Sarah. It's worth having a little look. It's very, very affordable.
And just very briefly, actually, you mentioned there's a few people on the call who've been involved in that. Is there anyone who wants to kind of give a quick testimonial and speak to the value of what you've done with their school?
Sarah might.
No pressure.
Go on, Sarah.
Okay, so I've recently completed CAFE. I was part of the last cohort that did the training. Before I started the training, I didn't know much, really, to be honest. I knew that climate change was a thing, but I can't say that it was that important to me at the time. And the training has really helped embed a really strong foundation now for me as a sustainability lead for a primary school to be able to start this work and this journey to be able to weave climate change education into the curriculum. We're really lucky. I've got the senior leadership team and the governors 100% on board and full support to be able to do this. So we're all working together. We've decided that the best possible starting point is to do map out the current journey of a child from reception through to year 6 of currently where their climate education actually sits and what, let's face it, little they actually learn currently about climate change education. And then we're going to move forward from that stage and have a look and see where we can weave in and what to make sure that it's done once and it's done well instead of having to keep rechanging it.
Fabulous. So I think that's a thumbs up. Yeah. Okay, we're coming to the end of this session, and I feel like we've opened up so many different kind of possibilities for discussion. Stories from the classroom. We're trying to convey what different schools are already doing to do innovative work with children and young people, and I think this has been a fabulous example of that. We've got an event, we haven't got a date planned yet, but hopefully in September we've got another story from the classroom with to try and highlight some of the work that the Climate Cares Centre at Imperial have been doing in conversations with young people and with educators about what works, and particularly kind of what works in a way that's supportive to that addresses that despair point that Lee mentioned, what works from a mental health perspective. But we'd really like your ideas as to what's useful in this space. Tamsin's got a poll that she can put up to give us some feedback about this session. And is there a second poll, Tamsin, with ideas for future sessions.
That's the second question on the poll that hopefully everyone can see on their screens now.
Okay. But even if you don't manage to think off the top of your head about what might be useful, if you want to forward ideas, suggestions to myself or Josephine, we'd love to try and feature that in one of these sessions. Or I should mention as well, we've got Kathy Debro on the call. Our Shared World do a monthly lunchtime learning session, which is even shorter than these ones. It's half an hour, but they managed to pack a lot into that. So, you know, between this and those learning lunches, I'm sure that there's more stuff that we can feature and get out there. What I will do is, before we finish, is say a big thank you to Lee and all the people at Cape, to Hina, to the head teachers in the schools that you're working with, to the trustees. Thank you so much for giving your time to share with us.
Not a problem. Thank you for the invitation.
Before you go, if people, you know, if you've learned anything from this session or appreciated anything from this session, feel free to put that into the chat. And before you go, Josephine, I don't know if you want to do just kind of a minute on Climate Courage Schools and the particular asks that we've got for people from that.
Yes, so as you probably know, because I've probably been emailing you all, work with Les on the Climate Courage campaign. So what we're really about is on spotlighting all of the amazing work that's already going on, and then highlighting, you know, what needs to change at a kind of like central level to support teachers and schools to do this across the board. And we launched a couple of weeks ago, so if you haven't watched that video, then we'll send over the recording for that. In the meantime, what we're really, really interested in collecting are stories, like personal stories from teachers, from parents, from young people, from mental health professionals about, you know, why is change so important? You know, what are you seeing in young people in classrooms that demonstrates the you know, the way in which the current education system is just like not providing our children with what it needs to. These testimonials are really going to form the backbone of the campaign coming into the autumn, because, you know, we've got people, you know this. We know that climate anxiety amongst young people is a massive issue. We know that teachers feel massively unsupported, but the data's all there, but there aren't, I think, quite enough stories coming forward and in the media and getting put to politicians about just, you know, what the situation is really like. So if you can help us with that at all, then we'd love to hear from you. And if you have any other questions at all, just get in touch. And thank you again, Lee.
So I've just put a link in the chat to that. Tell us your story. We're also looking for case studies of people who are doing this stuff. And I'll put a link into the chat for that as well. Some very sparky chats in the breakout. I think
I like that.
I think that's a good thing, right? Kathy has put in a link to the next Our Shared World Learning Lunch, Stephen Sterling, next Tuesday at 1:15. I can vouch for those as being really insightful and brief events.
Great, thank you all.
Okay, thank you everybody. Enjoy your evenings and enjoy the summer holidays if you're working at school when you get there.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Oh, and thank you to Tamsin as well for doing all the background stuff and moving us in and out of rooms. Thank you, Tamsin.
Thanks so much, Lee and Liz. Thanks.
No problem. Nice to see you, Kathy.
See you, all the best.
Bye.